Welcome back to Lore at Night, where rain gently falls and every story carries a shadow. I'm always curious to hear where in the world you're listening from, so comment that down below. Now get comfortable, and let's begin with the first story. The head was discovered at first light when the fog still clung low to the water and the harbor lights burned pale against the morning. A maintenance worker clearing debris along the shoreline noticed something pale among the rocks, a shape too smooth to be driftwood and too deliberate to be debris. It rested just above the waterline, positioned as if the lake had set it there carefully and then withdrawn. By the time patrol units arrived, the fog had thinned enough to reveal the face. The shoreline sat just south of the shipping terminals in Duluth, a working stretch of water where the lake met industry and recreation without ceremony. Cargo cranes loomed behind the police tape, frozen in place like long-armed silhouettes. The head had been placed on a flat stone, upright, facing inland. There were no signs of animal activity. No drag marks. No blood in the water. The absence of blood was the first thing that unsettled investigators. Paul Stafford, a senior detective with 20 years in violent crimes, arrived as the forensic team was still setting up portable lights. Paul had learned to measure scenes by what they lacked, as much as by what they showed. This one felt stripped down, almost intentional in its restraint. The severing had been clean, done elsewhere, and the head transported here with care. It suggested time, privacy, and a degree of control that rarely accompanied impulsive violence. The face belonged to a white male, estimated mid-30s to early 40s. The skin had begun to pale from cold exposure, but the features were intact. The eyes were open, fixed on the distant line of warehouses and rail tracks. The expression was neutral, neither contorted nor peaceful, which made it harder to read. Paul found himself resisting the instinct to assign emotion to it. Ty Simpson, newly promoted and still adjusting to the weight of decision-making, managed perimeter control. Ty noticed the way people slowed their cars as they passed, drawn by the lights and the unnatural stillness. Word had not yet reached the morning news, but Duluth was small enough that it would not stay contained for long. Ty focused on procedure, on keeping the curious at a distance, on giving the scene room to speak before the city did. The forensic pathologist documented the cut with clinical precision. The severance occurred between the third and fourth cervical vertebrae. The tool was sharp, likely a heavy blade, and the motion had been confident. There were no hesitation marks. The time since death was estimated between 12 and 24 hours, with the head exposed to cold air and lake moisture for several of those hours. The rest of the body was not in the water nearby. That absence expanded the case outward immediately, from a contained shoreline incident to a search with no obvious boundaries. Reed Clymer arrived next, a crime scene analyst whose strength lay in pattern recognition rather than instinct. Reed circled the area slowly, documenting footprints that belonged to first responders and maintenance crews, then widening the search radius. He found no cigarette butts, no fibers, no obvious signs of a struggle. The stone where the head rested was dry, its surface free of smears. Whoever placed it there had either worn gloves or had cleaned it deliberately. The lake itself offered no answers. Sonar sweeps would come later, but the currents near the harbor were unpredictable, shaped by shipping traffic and weather shifts. If the body had entered the water elsewhere, it could surface miles away or not at all. Paul understood that Lake Superior had a way of swallowing evidence without malice, simply by scale and temperature. It was not a place that gave things back easily. Identification became the immediate priority. The head was transported under escort to the medical examiner's office, where fingerprints were taken despite the cold stiffening the skin. Dental photographs followed. There were no visible tattoos or piercings, no distinctive scars above the neckline. The hair was cut short professionally within the last few weeks. The beard was trimmed evenly. The care and grooming suggested someone who paid attention to how he appeared, or someone who had reason to. Allison Jones, assigned to missing persons liaison, began cross-referencing recent reports. Within hours, she noted the absence of any matching cases. No recent missing adult males in Duluth fit the age and appearance. That gap introduced another possibility, that the victim was not local or that his disappearance had gone unreported. Both options carried different implications, neither reassuring. Claire Johnson, brought in from the regional task force due to the severity of the case, reviewed traffic camera data near the harbor. She focused on the narrow access roads that service the shoreline, routes used mostly by maintenance vehicles and late-night fishermen. Between midnight and dawn, only a handful of vehicles passed through. One delivery truck stopped briefly at 3:12 a.m., its hazard lights on for less than 2 minutes. The driver's log would need verification. Another vehicle, unregistered in the system, appeared only as a blur of headlights, its plate unreadable due to glare. Susan Montgomery from the State Crime Lab began preparing for DNA analysis. She noted the absence of trace material beneath the fingernails, an unusual detail even for a severed head. It suggested that the victim had not struggled at the moment of death, or that the hands had been cleaned afterward. Either interpretation implied control exerted over the circumstances, a dynamic that pointed toward familiarity or premeditation. As the morning wore on, the fog lifted completely, revealing the lake in full, cold clarity. The harbor resumed its rhythm. Ships moved. Trains sounded their horns. The city continued, partially aware that something irrevocable had occurred along its edge. News crews arrived by mid-morning, their cameras trained on the police tape, their questions unanswered. Paul convened a brief meeting, careful to keep it procedural. They had a victim with no name, a body elsewhere, and a placement that felt communicative without being explicit. The head faced the city, not the water. It was impossible not to consider intention in that orientation. Reed cautioned against assigning meaning too early. Ty noted the efficiency of the placement, how quickly it would be found once daylight came. Claire pointed out the timing, late enough to avoid witnesses, early enough to ensure discovery. By afternoon, the first partial fingerprint match returned, inconclusive but promising. It linked the victim to a previous arrest record from another county, a nonviolent charge, sealed due to age. The name was withheld pending confirmation, but the existence of a record shifted the investigation's posture. The victim had history, however minor, and history created threads. As dusk approached, divers prepared to enter the water despite low expectations. The shoreline was re-examined inch by inch. Still nothing surfaced to explain how a man could be reduced to a single, deliberate fragment and delivered to the city's edge without leaving a trail. Paul stood near the water as the light faded, watching the surface darken. He understood that the case would not unfold quickly. Whoever had done this had taken care with the first move, and first moves often set the tempo for everything that followed. The head had been left to speak, but it had not yet said enough. The second day, the investigation had settled into its true shape, broader and more uncomfortable than the shoreline suggested. The head no longer felt like an endpoint, but a deliberate opening, a way to force attention without revealing direction. Paul recognized the pattern from rare cases that stayed with him. When violence was staged with restraint, it usually meant the perpetrator was confident enough to wait. The preliminary fingerprint analysis advanced overnight. Susan confirmed that the partial match came from a small county nearly 200 miles south. The arrest was old, a misdemeanor involving property damage, expunged from public view but still accessible to law enforcement. The name attached to it belonged to a man who had kept his footprint light since then. No recent warrants, no known enemies. No obvious reason for escalation into ritualized violence. That distance mattered. It suggested mobility and planning, and it widened the map immediately. Allison coordinated with neighboring jurisdictions, requesting quiet checks of recent missing person reports that had not yet reached statewide databases. She focused on men who lived alone, whose absence might go unnoticed for days or weeks. The work was slow and emotionally uneven. Some calls ended with relief, others opened into uncertainty that had not yet solidified into alarm. Reed shifted his attention to the object itself, not as a body part, but as a transported item. He reviewed photographs of the stone, the surrounding rocks, the orientation relative to the shoreline access points. The placement required someone to walk at least 30 yards from the nearest parking area, over uneven ground, in low light. It was not convenient. That choice narrowed the type of person who would attempt it, someone physically steady, unhurried, and willing to risk being seen briefly in order to achieve precision. Ty worked through overnight traffic data, expanding Claire's initial sweep. He traced the unregistered headlights farther back through the network of cameras, finding them again at a rural intersection 40 minutes earlier. The vehicle moved without urgency, never exceeding speed limits, never stopping longer than necessary. It disappeared where coverage thinned, near a stretch of highway that cut through forested land and private roads. The absence of identifying markers felt intentional, but not panicked. Claire cross-referenced that route with known dumping sites and abandoned structures. She found 3 properties within a 10-mile radius that had changed ownership recently, all purchased through limited liability companies with no local ties. The purchases were legal and unremarkable on paper, but their timing clustered tightly within the last 6 months. The properties were modest, secluded, and offered privacy without drawing attention. Paul hesitated before assigning resources. He understood the danger of seeing patterns where coincidence could suffice. Still, the case had already signaled deliberation. Ignoring possible infrastructure felt riskier than pursuing it. At the medical examiner's office, Susan completed a deeper examination of the head. Microscopic analysis revealed faint fibers embedded near the hairline, synthetic, consistent with automotive upholstery. There were trace residues of a cleaning agent along the jaw, strong enough to remove biological material, but diluted to avoid leaving a scent. The choice suggested familiarity with both forensic limitations and practical concealment. It did not require specialized training, only curiosity and patience. The cut itself yielded more information. Tool mark analysis pointed toward a single blade implement, heavy, likely sharpened regularly. There were no signs of serration. The angle of entry suggested the victim was restrained or incapacitated at the time of death. The lack of defensive injuries supported that conclusion. Susan noted that this was not a crime of chaos. It was one of control, where the victim's awareness may have been minimal at the final moment. That detail shifted the psychological center of the case. Paul considered what it meant to choose a method that minimized struggle. It could signal a desire to avoid noise or mess, or it could reflect something quieter, an aversion to confrontation, or even a misplaced sense of order. Such traits did not narrow the field much, but they shaped the profile away from impulsive rage. Divers completed their second sweep without success. The lake gave back nothing, reinforcing the likelihood that the body was elsewhere. Attention turned inland. By the third morning, Allison found a tentative match. A man named Michael, last known address in a small town south of the county where the old arrest had occurred, had missed work for 4 days. His employer initially assumed illness, but calls went unanswered. There was no family nearby. His landlord reported nothing unusual, only that the apartment appeared tidy when maintenance entered to check for a water leak. The description matched the head closely enough to justify confirmation. Dental records arrived that afternoon. Susan confirmed the match with clinical certainty. The victim had a name, a job, and a life that had continued without alarm until it stopped. Paul reviewed Michael's history in silence. There was nothing dramatic in it. Steady employment. Few close relationships. No recent financial distress. His digital footprint was sparse, limited to routine transactions and occasional searches related to hobbies. That ordinariness felt significant. It suggested that the reason for his death lay outside his visible life, perhaps in a connection he did not advertise or did not understand as dangerous. Claire traced Michael's movements in the weeks before his death. He had traveled north twice, each trip lasting less than a day. Both visits coincided with weekends and left no clear explanation in his calendar. Credit card records showed fuel purchases near the city, then nothing. No hotel stays. No entertainment expenses. He came and went quietly. Those trips aligned with the property purchases Reed had flagged. One property, a small lakeside cabin, sat just beyond the reach of routine patrols. Another, an old workshop near a decommissioned rail spur, showed recent utility activation despite no registered business operating there. The third was a farmhouse, vacant but maintained. The team split focus. Ty and Reed began background work on the shell companies. Allison contacted Michael's employer and landlord for deeper context. Susan prepared to process any new physical evidence if access was granted. Claire coordinated surveillance requests, careful to avoid alerting anyone prematurely. Paul felt the pressure of sequencing. If the perpetrator was local to those properties, they might already sense attention. Yet moving too slowly risked losing whatever infrastructure supported the crime. He weighed the head again in his mind, its careful placement, its calm presentation. It did not feel like an act meant to vanish into obscurity. It felt like the first step in something meant to be seen, then followed. Late that evening, a utility company returned Claire's inquiry. One of the properties showed a spike in water usage the night before the head was discovered, far exceeding normal levels. The pattern suggested cleaning rather than habitation. It was a small detail, but it aligned too neatly to ignore. Paul authorized a warrant request, limited and quiet. They would approach the property at first light with minimal personnel, prepared for absence rather than confrontation. As plans formed, the case shifted again, from reconstruction toward intrusion. No one said it aloud, but the underlying question sharpened. If the head was meant to be found, and if Michael's life had intersected with a place built for privacy, then the investigation was no longer only about what had happened. It was about whether the act was complete, or merely the beginning. The warrant was executed just after sunrise, when the light was thin and directional, revealing details without softening them. The lakeside cabin sat back from the road, its driveway rutted but recently driven. Snow along the edges had been compressed into shallow ridges that suggested multiple trips rather than neglect. Paul noted that detail as they approached, a sign of routine, not abandonment. The cabin door opened without resistance. Inside, the air held the faint chemical flatness of recent cleaning. The interior was spare, furnished but not lived in. There were no personal photographs, no accumulated clutter, no signs of long-term habitation. Reed moved methodically through the space, documenting surfaces under alternate light. In the bathroom, faint traces of biological material glowed briefly along the drain before dissolving into nothing under further inspection. The residue was minimal, consistent with thorough washing rather than a hurried attempt. Susan's team followed with sampling kits. The water heater was still warm. In the main room, Ty found a workbench pushed against the far wall. Its surface bore shallow cut marks, irregular and overlapping, not decorative and not random. The wood beneath had been replaced recently, the screws new and clean, as if the surface itself had been discarded and renewed. The choice suggested an awareness of where evidence lingered longest. Someone had learned, perhaps through experience, what could not be erased. Outside, Claire traced the property line. She found tire impressions leading toward a secondary access path that bypassed the main road. The path connected to a service lane used decades earlier for logging operations. It was overgrown, but passable. Following it led to the edge of the second property, the workshop near the rail spur. That structure told a different story. The workshop smelled of oil and old metal, a place where time had accumulated rather than been scrubbed away. Its floor bore stains that predated the current ownership, layered history that complicated interpretation. Yet in one corner, beneath a hanging tarp, Susan found a shallow trench cut into the concrete. The edges were rough, but intentional. Within it, trace amounts of blood remained, absorbed too deeply to remove entirely. The blood belonged to Michael. The workshop's utilities had been activated only recently. Electrical lines fed a single overhead light. There were no cameras inside, but a conduit suggested wiring had been planned, then abandoned. Reed photographed the conduit carefully. Incomplete preparation often pointed to interruption rather than indecision. Paul stood back and let the scene settle. The separation between the cabin and the workshop felt deliberate. One space for containment and control, another for the act itself. Neither location held signs of panic. The sequence had unfolded according to design, not reaction. The farmhouse, searched later that day, yielded less, but still mattered. Its basement had been reinforced, beams added where none were needed structurally. The air was dry and cool. There were no stains, no marks, no residue. It was empty in a way that felt anticipatory rather than abandoned. Allison noted that the property had no history of occupancy beyond short maintenance visits. Someone had invested in readiness without using it yet. As evidence accumulated, the portrait of the perpetrator sharpened without resolving. The shell companies traced back through a web of legal registrations that terminated in a trust managed out of state. The structure was lawful, meticulous, and frustratingly opaque. It did not point to wealth so much as patience. Michael's connection to the properties emerged slowly. Credit card data showed fuel purchases near the cabin on both of his unexplained trips north. Cell tower records placed him within range of the workshop on the night of his death. There were no calls, no messages, no digital trail explaining why he was there. The absence suggested secrecy or trust, perhaps both. Allison reviewed Michael's personal effects recovered from his apartment. Among them was a notebook, unremarkable at first glance. Its pages held lists, not of names or plans, but of measurements and dates. The entries were sparse and spaced irregularly, as if recorded only when necessary. Reed recognized the pattern as preparatory rather than reflective. Someone documenting conditions, not thoughts. One entry corresponded to the cabin's location, noted weeks before the first trip north. Another aligned with the workshop, marked only by a coordinate pair. Michael had been moving towards something, not away from it. The implication unsettled the team. It suggested participation, voluntary or coerced, in a process he may not have fully understood. Paul considered the psychology of incremental commitment, how small steps could be framed as harmless until retreat felt more dangerous than continuation. Control did not always require force at the outset. Late that night, Susan returned with results from fiber analysis. The synthetic material embedded near Michael's hairline matched the upholstery of a specific vehicle model, a utility van manufactured within a narrow date range. Registration data would be extensive, but not infinite. Ty began compiling a list. Claire reviewed regional reports for similar property purchases and utility activations. She found two more, farther north, both acquired under different company names but following the same legal template. Neither had been searched yet. Their existence expanded the case again, suggesting a network rather than a single event. Paul felt the investigation crossing a threshold. What began as a contained act of violence now hinted at a system, one that could persist beyond a single victim. The head on the shoreline had not been discarded. It had been delivered, a marker placed at the edge of visibility. As midnight approached, a notification arrived from a neighboring jurisdiction. A maintenance worker had reported suspicious activity near one of the newly identified properties. Lights at odd hours, deliveries with no clear purpose. The report was routine, filed days earlier, but now it carried weight. Paul authorized surveillance rather than immediate entry. If the perpetrator believed the sequence was unfolding as planned, disruption might provoke mistakes. The team prepared to watch, to wait, and to document rather than intervene. From the shoreline in Duluth to the quiet roads beyond it, the case had revealed its first true shape. It was not finished speaking. It was arranging itself, step by careful step, and whatever came next would not be improvised. The surveillance began without ceremony, the way most decisive moments do. Unmarked vehicles rotated in 12-hour shifts along the rural roads that threaded between the properties. Cameras were positioned to observe without intruding. The goal was not confrontation, but confirmation, a chance to see the system function rather than interrupt it prematurely. It took 3 nights. On the third, shortly after dusk, a utility van entered the service lane near the northernmost property. Its approach was unhurried, its headlights dimmed rather than switched off. The vehicle matched the upholstery profile Susan had identified. Ty logged the plate as it passed under a temporary camera. The registration returned within minutes, clean and local, registered to a small equipment rental business owned by a single individual. Reed noted the consistency immediately. The same van had appeared in traffic data near the Duluth harbor the night the head was placed. It had not lingered. It had arrived, stopped briefly, and left. The driver exited the van and entered the farmhouse alone. The lights inside remained off. Only a faint glow from the basement window marked activity below ground. Claire watched the feed closely, noting the duration. 47 minutes passed before the driver emerged, carrying nothing visible, and departed along the same route. Paul authorized the move. The arrest occurred the following morning, away from the properties, during a routine stop staged to avoid escalation. The individual did not resist. There was no attempt to flee. His demeanor was composed, almost relieved, as if the narrowing of possibility had ended something he had been maintaining by effort alone. Search warrants executed simultaneously filled in what surveillance could not. The farmhouse basement, previously empty, had been prepared as a receiving space. Drainage had been improved, surfaces sealed. A restraint system had been installed and then partially removed. The design was modular, adaptable. It had not yet been used fully. The workshop held the implements, cleaned but not discarded. The cabin contained records. Those records resolved the final uncertainty. Michael had not been selected at random. He had been recruited. Months earlier, the perpetrator had placed discreet advertisements online, framed as research participation, offering payment for involvement in a study on endurance and stress tolerance. The language was clinical, the compensation modest but steady. Michael responded. His notebooks were not instructions given to him, but measurements he was asked to take. Physical data recorded during early sessions that occurred at neutral locations. Trust was built incrementally, through consistency rather than force. The properties were presented to Michael as controlled environments for later phases. He visited voluntarily, believing the work legitimate, if unusual. The final session occurred at the workshop. Michael was restrained under the premise of safety monitoring. He was incapacitated before understanding the full nature of the situation. Susan's findings aligned with that sequence precisely. The perpetrator's motive emerged not as anger or profit, but fixation. He documented everything, not as trophies but as data. The severed head was not an act of rage or symbolism in the conventional sense. It was a proof point, a way to test response, to observe how authorities prioritized, how quickly patterns were recognized. The orientation toward the city was not personal. It was directional, aimed at the system rather than the victim. Paul recognized the psychology immediately once it was laid bare. Control expressed through structure, curiosity stripped of empathy, violence reduced to procedure. The absence of panic throughout the crime reflected not confidence alone, but immersion. This was not an interruption of the perpetrator's life. It was its organizing principle. Confronted with the evidence, the perpetrator did not deny the acts. He acknowledged Michael's death as an outcome, not a goal, a variable resolved, rather than a life ended. There was no attempt to justify it morally. Only explanations framed in process and observation. The investigation concluded without further discoveries. No additional victims were identified. The other properties had been prepared, but unused, contingencies rather than sites of repetition. The system had been interrupted early enough to prevent continuation, though not early enough to save Michael. The head was returned to the body once it was recovered from a remote burial site inland, chosen for its soil composition and isolation. The placement at the shoreline remained the only public gesture, the single deviation from secrecy. As the case closed, Paul reviewed the sequence one final time. The restraint, the patience, the deliberate invitation to be found. It had been an experiment that ended the moment it attracted sustained attention. The lake returned to its routines. The harbor lights cycled on and off. And the system that had briefly intersected with the city's edge was dismantled piece by careful piece, leaving behind only records, empty structures, and a question that no longer required answering. Now, let's get into the next story for tonight. The first sign that something had gone wrong was not the missing person report or a neighbor's panic. It was a truck, still idling, nosed crooked into the red clay shoulder of a service road that rarely saw traffic after dark. The headlights were on, washing the pine trunks in a pale fan, and the driver's door was left open as if the man inside had simply stepped out to check a tire and never returned. The road belonged to the in-between spaces outside Athens, Georgia, where subdivisions thinned into horse pasture and then into the kind of woods that could make a city feel far away in a matter of minutes. The service road ran alongside a drainage ditch, bordered by ragged blackberry thorns, and it led to a tucked-away cluster of municipal water infrastructure, a place people did not visit unless they worked there, had gotten lost, or had something to hide. Sheriff's deputies arrived just after midnight, called in by a county maintenance worker who had been driving home from a late shift and recognized the truck as belonging to someone who did not make mistakes, like leaving an engine running. The worker did not approach the vehicle. He stood back, watched the quiet tremble of exhaust in the beam of the headlights, and waited for uniforms to make the world official. The man who owned the truck was Blake Freeman, 38, employed by a regional paving contractor that held contracts across Clark and Oconee County. Supervisors described him as dependable without sounding affectionate. His record was clean, his bills were paid on time, his social life modest and predictable. He lived in a small ranch house near Winterville, kept his yard trimmed, and usually answered the phone on the second ring. Inside the truck, deputies found a thermos in the cup holder, its lid loose, coffee pooled in the indentation around it. The glove compartment was open. A folded county road map sat on the passenger seat with a pen laid across it. The truck keys were still in the ignition. There was no wallet on the dashboard, no phone on the seat, no obvious sign of struggle. The scene felt staged in its calmness, like a room after a fire has been scrubbed clean of soot. A beam from a flashlight caught something on the clay near the open door. A single boot print pressed deep, the tread sharp, then another print that began and ended abruptly, as if the boot had been lifted and carried. The clay there was damp from the previous afternoon's rain, The prints should have continued. They did not. The deputies spread out with measured caution, moving along the ditch line. The air smelled like wet soil and pine sap. Frogs kept calling, undisturbed, in the darkness. A set of tire tracks ran off the service road and into a narrow pull-off near the tree line. They did not match Blake's truck. The tracks were fresh enough that the clay edges had not yet crumbled back in. The search widened slowly, because panic was not yet justified by evidence. They called Blake's phone. It rang, faint and distant, then stopped. A deputy moved toward the sound and found the phone half buried in leaves near the drainage ditch, its screen cracked in a spiderweb pattern. The phone was powered on. The emergency call function had been pressed and canceled, not completed, leaving a thin detail that suggested intent and interruption. The moment the phone was found, the scene shifted from strange to serious. Investigators from the sheriff's office were called in, then a K9 unit. The phone's location was marked with a small flag. Photos were taken of the boot print. Deputies stood near the idling truck and listened to its engine, steady and indifferent, as if it belonged to no one. By 2 a.m, the K9 handler arrived with a German Shepherd that moved with tight focus, nose low, tail level. The dog circled the open door, sniffed the ground, then started down the ditch line toward the municipal water facility. Deputies followed, careful not to trample the clay. The dog paused near a concrete culvert, pressed its muzzle into a seam of weeds, and strained forward, pulling hard enough that the handler had to brace his heels. Beyond the culvert was a narrow embankment leading to a fenced-off area where a small access gate stood with a padlock. The padlock was intact. The gate had not been cut, but the chain around it was twisted in a way that suggested it had been pulled hard, then released. A deputy shone a light along the fence and found a section where the bottom edge had been lifted slightly, just enough for a person to crawl under if they were willing to tear their clothes and scrape their skin. On the other side of the fence, the ground dipped into a shallow basin. The basin held rainwater and silt, turning it into dark, slick mud. The dog stood at the fence, whining, then shifted direction abruptly as if the scent had scattered. A search team entered through the gate, using keys obtained from the on-call municipal supervisor. They moved with a grid pattern, lights sweeping. One deputy found a scrap of fabric snagged on the fence wire. Blue denim, the kind used in work jeans. Another found a smear on a concrete slab near a pump housing. Not dark enough to be obvious blood, but too irregular to be only mud. Under the light it looked brown, rusty, and thin. When investigators arrived, they treated the slab as a potential contact point. They photographed it, then tested it. The first quick test suggested blood, but not conclusively enough to satisfy anyone who had seen false positives before. The smear shape mattered more than its chemistry. It looked like a handprint dragged by pressure, fingers splayed, then pulled away. At dawn, with morning fog rising from the basin, they found Blake. He was not far from the concrete slab, tucked behind a stand of tall grass near a utility shed that held spare piping. His body lay on its side, knees drawn slightly in, as if he had sought shelter and run out of time. His shirt was torn at the shoulder. One of his work boots was missing. His face was turned toward the ground, and the skin of his neck carried a bruised discoloration that made the medical examiner's assistant fall silent for a moment before moving closer. The investigators did not describe the scene as brutal. They described it as controlled. There was no chaotic scatter of items, no wide radius of destruction. Whatever had happened close. Blake had not sprinted. He had not fought wildly. The physical evidence suggested brief force, then movement, then stillness, leaving behind questions that the quiet morning could not answer. The medical examiner's preliminary findings arrived before the sun had fully burned off the fog. Blake Freeman had died sometime between 10 and midnight, the window defined by stomach contents, body temperature, and the slow, methodical certainty that came from experience rather than drama. Cause of death was manual strangulation. There were no ligature marks, no cord or wire impressions. The bruising along his neck suggested sustained pressure applied with intent and control. His hyoid bone was intact, which narrowed the manner but not the possibilities. Whoever had killed him had been close enough to feel resistance and had not let go when it came. There were abrasions on Blake's forearms and palms, shallow and uneven, consistent with contact against rough ground rather than defensive wounds. His fingernails were short and clean, with no visible skin beneath them. The absence mattered. It suggested either surprise or restraint, or a psychological hesitation that investigators would later return to when they began to understand Blake's final moments as something other than a sudden ambush. The missing boot was found later that morning in the drainage ditch, half submerged, filled with water and silt. It carried no obvious impressions other than Blake's own, the tread worn in a way that matched the remaining boot still on his foot. The discovery closed one loop, but opened another. If Blake had not run, why had his boot come off at all? The answer would not be obvious, and the question would linger longer than expected. Investigators reconstructed Blake's last known movements with the tools available to them. His phone records showed no completed calls after 9:17 p.m., when he had briefly connected with a number belonging to a local aggregate supplier. The call lasted under a minute. There were no messages sent afterward. His phone's location data placed him on the service road by 9:42 p.m. The engine of his truck had likely been running for over 2 hours by the time it was found, a small detail that suggested interruption rather than arrival. Blake's employer confirmed that he had left a job site near Watkinsville earlier that evening than usual, citing a personal errand. He had not been scheduled to inspect any municipal sites that night. The folded road map found in his truck was dated but marked in pen with a circle near the water facility, a notation that did not match any known work order. When investigators asked coworkers about it, no one could explain why Blake would have needed a paper map at all. He usually relied on his phone. At his house near Winterville, investigators found nothing immediately alarming. The place was tidy in the way of someone who lived alone and valued predictability. There was food in the refrigerator, laundry folded on the couch, a calendar on the kitchen wall with dates crossed off in neat lines. The day of his death was blank. His wallet was found on the kitchen counter, set beside his keys to a different vehicle. Inside were cash, cards, and a folded receipt from a gas station, 2 miles from the service road. Time-stamped 9:06 p.m. neighbors described Blake as quiet and polite. He waved, he kept to himself, he did not host gatherings. One neighbor mentioned seeing a dark sedan parked near Blake's driveway the previous week, late at night, engine off, lights dark. The neighbor could not say how long it stayed or whether Blake interacted with it. The detail was noted and filed, neither dismissed nor elevated. The investigation began to form its first shape around opportunity. Who knew Blake would be at that location, at that time? Who could have drawn him there without force? The map suggested premeditation on Blake's part, not someone else's. The canceled emergency call suggested that whatever had gone wrong had done so quickly, perhaps during a moment of recognition rather than fear. Investigators looked closely at Blake's work. Paving contracts involved money, materials, and schedules that sometimes invited shortcuts. They reviewed recent disputes, invoices, and site reports. One project stood out, a delayed resurfacing job where materials had gone missing and blame had been quietly redistributed to avoid penalties. Blake had been the last supervisor on site. He had also signed off on quantities that later did not match supplier records. When asked about it weeks earlier, Blake had not escalated the discrepancy. He had corrected paperwork, absorbed the difference, and moved on. At least that was the official version. Investigators wondered whether the decision had truly been Blake's, or whether it had been encouraged by someone who benefited from silence. They also examined Blake's personal finances. His accounts showed no sudden windfalls, no unusual withdrawals. There was a modest savings balance, a mortgage payment that cleared each month, and a single recent transfer to a personal checking account labeled only with initials. The amount was small enough to be overlooked, but the timing placed it 3 days before his death. The recipient account belonged to a woman named Laura Bennett, who lived in Athens and worked as a bookkeeper for a small equipment rental company. Laura told investigators that Blake was a friend. They had known each other casually for years. The transfer, she said, was repayment for a loan he had taken months earlier when his truck needed repairs. She appeared cooperative, her account consistent, her demeanor calm. She acknowledged meeting Blake occasionally for coffee, always in public, always brief. She denied seeing him on the night he died. Her phone records showed no contact with Blake that evening. Her location data placed her at home. There was no immediate reason to doubt her. Still, investigators noted that she had access to financial records through her job, and that her employer rented equipment to Blake's company on a regular basis. Lines began to form that did not yet cross but ran close enough to be uncomfortable. Attention returned to the water facility. Access logs showed no official entries that night. Security cameras covered only the main access road, not the service road or the basin beyond the fence. The facility supervisor confirmed that the fence had been lifted before, usually by trespassers looking for a shortcut or a place to drink. Nothing about the damage stood out as deliberate. The tire tracks near the pull-off were analyzed. They belonged to a mid-sized sedan, common tread, nothing distinctive enough to narrow the field. No vehicle matching the tracks was captured on nearby traffic cameras during the relevant window. Either the vehicle had approached from a direction without coverage, or it had waited long enough to leave after cameras cycled. As days passed, the case resisted simplicity. There was no weapon to find, no clear motive that announced itself. Blake Freeman did not live loudly. He did not gamble, drink heavily, or cultivate enemies, yet someone had chosen to meet him in a place that offered darkness, isolation, and just enough familiarity to lower his guard. Investigators began to consider the possibility that Blake had gone there willingly, believing he was in control of the situation. The folded map, the early departure from work, the canceled emergency call, all pointed toward a meeting that shifted suddenly. The absence of defensive wounds suggested that Blake had not anticipated violence, or had been constrained by trust rather than fear. By the end of the second week, the investigation stalled in a way that felt dangerous. Leads existed, but none converged. The case file grew thicker, not clearer. And beneath the procedural calm, a quieter realization took hold among the investigators. Blake's death did not look like a crime of impulse. It looked like a correction, precise and contained, carried out by someone who understood how little force was needed to end a life when proximity and timing were right. The question that remained, and that pressed harder with each passing day, was not who could have killed Blake Freeman. It was who believed they had to. The break in the case did not arrive with urgency or spectacle. It came through repetition, through the quiet discipline of returning to details that had already been examined, and asking why they still felt unsettled. Investigators began again with the assumption that Blake Freeman had gone to the service road willingly, believing the meeting to be contained, brief, and manageable. That belief narrowed the field more effectively than any database search. They reconstructed the geography of Blake's evening not just by timestamps, but by intention. The gas station receipt at 9:06 p.m. placed him 2 miles from the service road. He had fueled up despite having enough gas to get home. The act suggested preparation rather than convenience. He expected to be out longer than usual, but not long enough to disrupt routine. The folded map, marked in pen, was not something Blake carried casually. It had been placed deliberately, likely earlier that day, folded and refolded until the crease aligned with the circled location. Investigators returned to Blake's phone, examining deleted data more closely. The canceled emergency call had occurred at 9:49 p.m. The screen fracture pattern indicated impact against a hard surface, likely the concrete slab near the pump housing. The phone had not skidded or bounced. It had dropped straight down, consistent with a loss of grip rather than forceful throwing. That detail supported a scenario where Blake's attention had been pulled upward, away from the device, at the precise moment he tried to act. The missing boot became more than a stray item. Forensic analysis showed scuffing along the heel and side, not from walking, but from dragging against resistance. The boot had likely been caught under Blake's body during a struggle that remained close and contained. The pressure required to pull it free would have come not from frantic motion, but from leverage applied by someone positioned above him. Investigators returned to the notion of proximity. Manual strangulation required sustained contact. It demanded time, balance, and a willingness to remain present as the body responded. It was not an act chosen by someone unfamiliar or distant. It was chosen by someone who could remain steady while feeling another person's breath fail. They revisited Blake's work records with a narrower focus. The delayed resurfacing project, once treated as a minor administrative discrepancy, now appeared differently. Material shortages had been attributed to supplier error, then quietly resolved through internal adjustments. Blake's signature appeared on corrective documents, but metadata showed they had been edited on a device not assigned to him. The edits had been made late at night, from an IP address associated with the equipment rental company where Laura Bennett worked. When confronted with the technical inconsistency, Laura did not deny it. She acknowledged that she had helped Blake adjust paperwork in the past. She described it as assistance, not deception. Blake, she said, had been under pressure from a supervisor who wanted delays erased and losses absorbed without scrutiny. Laura's access to accounting systems made her useful. Her calm demeanor, which had once seemed neutral, now read as practiced. Investigators pressed further. They asked about the transfer of money, about the timing, about the dark sedan seen near Blake's house. Laura admitted that the sedan belonged to her. She said she had visited Blake that week to discuss a mistake she feared had gone too far. According to her, Blake had discovered that materials from the resurfacing project had been diverted intentionally, not lost. The diversion pointed upward, toward someone with authority and incentive. Blake had wanted to report it. Laura's role, as she described it, had shifted from helper to intermediary. She had offered to arrange a meeting with the supervisor involved, someone who would not meet Blake openly. The service road, she said, was chosen for discretion, not danger. She claimed she had not attended the meeting. She said she stayed home, waited, and later learned something had gone wrong. Her account aligned with some evidence and conflicted with other parts. Phone records confirmed no contact between Laura and Blake that evening, but investigators knew that absence could be intentional. More telling was the supervisor she named, a man whose authority over Blake had been real, but whose movements that night placed him out of the area. His alibi was supported by multiple independent sources. Attention returned to Laura, not as a suspect by default, but as the person closest to the convergence of trust, access, and opportunity. Investigators examined her phone again, this time focusing on location anomalies rather than call logs. A brief loss of signal appeared between 9:35 and 10:05 p.m., coinciding with the window of Blake's death. The gap could have been technical. It could also have been deliberate, the result of powering down a device. When presented with the location data, Laura's composure shifted. She did not argue the technology. She reframed the narrative. She said she had gone for a drive that night to clear her head, leaving her phone at home to avoid distraction. The explanation was plausible in isolation. It became less so when paired with the earlier transfer of money, the document edits, and her unique position between Blake and the concealed misconduct he intended to expose. Investigators returned to the water facility one final time, walking the route Blake would have taken. They stood where the fence had been lifted, where the concrete slab bore the faint residue of contact. They noted how sound carried, how quickly the basin swallowed movement. They considered how two people could meet there without being seen, how one could approach the other without raising alarm. The conclusion formed gradually, without a single definitive piece of evidence announcing it. Laura Bennett had not intended to kill Blake Freeman. The meeting had been meant to persuade him, to contain the damage, to keep a quiet arrangement from unraveling. But persuasion required proximity, and proximity had created vulnerability. When Blake refused to step back, when he moved to make the call he believed would protect him, Laura reacted not with calculation, but with force she had not planned to sustain. The medical evidence supported a scenario of escalation rather than premeditation. The absence of a weapon, the controlled nature of the injuries, the immediate abandonment of the scene, all pointed to an act that exceeded intention but not capability. Laura had known Blake well enough to get close enough to place her hands where resistance would fade before help could arrive. When arrested, Laura did not struggle. She did not deny her presence at the site. She did not claim accident. She acknowledged only that she had underestimated how quickly control could be lost when fear replaced negotiation. Her statement was brief, procedural, stripped of justification. The case closed without spectacle. There was no trial that stretched for years, no dramatic reversal. Blake Freeman's death was recorded as homicide, resolved through the convergence of small truths that could not coexist peacefully. The service road returned to its quiet function. The basin filled again with rainwater and silt. Blake's life ended where he believed a conversation could remain contained. It did not. And in the narrow space between trust and consequence, proximity proved heavier than anyone involved had anticipated. Now, let's get into the final story for tonight. The morning begins the way countless others have. The neighborhood is quiet, the air cool, and the holiday season lingers in the background with muted decorations and half-lit trees. Nothing about the street suggests that, within hours, it will become the focal point of one of the most scrutinized domestic murder investigations in modern American history. At the center of it all is Laci Peterson, a young woman who vanishes from her Modesto home on Christmas Eve. Laci is 27 years old and 8 months pregnant. Friends describe her as warm, organized, and deeply invested in the life she is preparing to bring into the world. She has been methodical about the nursery, careful about schedules, and attentive to the rhythms of her marriage. On that December morning, she plans to take the family dog for a walk, a simple routine that fits neatly into the quiet hours before holiday gatherings begin. It is the kind of ordinary act that leaves no impression at the time and becomes devastating in retrospect. By early afternoon, concern begins to surface. Laci has not returned home, and calls to her phone go unanswered. Her husband reports her missing, framing the disappearance as sudden and inexplicable. Within hours, neighbors are questioned, sidewalks are scanned, and the small details of Laci's last known movements are replayed again and again. The dog is found wandering nearby with its leash still attached, a detail that immediately unsettles investigators and family members alike. The case quickly draws the attention of local law enforcement in Modesto, a place unaccustomed to national scrutiny. Officers begin canvassing the area, knocking on doors and retracing potential walking routes. There are no obvious signs of struggle inside the home. No broken furniture, no blood. The absence of visible violence complicates the search, leaving investigators to consider a wide range of possibilities. Did Laci leave voluntarily? Was she abducted during her walk, or did something happen closer to home? As daylight fades, the search expands beyond the neighborhood. Volunteers arrive, some organized through family connections, and others drawn by instinctive concern. They move through parks, fields, and drainage areas, calling Lacey's name into the cold air. Her pregnancy adds urgency and emotional gravity to every hour that passes without answers. Each searcher understands that time matters, and that the window for a safe recovery narrows with every passing moment. Meanwhile, detectives begin assembling a timeline. They examine phone records, receipts, and recent conversations. They listen carefully to how events are described, noting what is said and what is omitted. Domestic cases often turn on these early details, on subtle inconsistencies that only become visible when placed side by side. Investigators are trained to remain cautious, but they are also aware that statistically, violence against a woman most often comes from someone she knows. That awareness does not yet define the case, but it quietly shapes the questions being asked. Media attention escalates rapidly. Within days, Lacey's photograph is broadcast across the country. Her smiling face, framed by dark hair and the visible curve of pregnancy, becomes instantly recognizable. Tips begin pouring in from far beyond Modesto, each one logged and assessed. Some claim sightings in neighboring towns. Others report suspicious vehicles or unfamiliar men. Most lead nowhere, but each must be checked, because the alternative is to risk overlooking the one detail that matters. As the investigation deepens, the focus shifts outward to the water. Lacey had mentioned nearby travel plans in casual conversation, and attention turns to the vast, cold expanse of the San Francisco Bay. Search teams deploy boats and sonar equipment, scanning areas that feel both too large and too precise at the same time. The bay offers no immediate answers, only the unsettling reminder that evidence can disappear as easily as people. Behind the scenes, detectives continue to study the dynamics of Lacey's life. They speak with friends about her marriage, her routines, and her expectations for the future. They examine financial records and recent purchases, looking for anything that suggests preparation or distress. What emerges is a portrait of a woman focused on stability, invested in her home, and eager for the arrival of her child. It is a portrait that makes voluntary disappearance increasingly difficult to reconcile. As days turn into weeks, the case hardens from a missing person investigation into something darker. The language used by authorities becomes more guarded. Hope remains, but it is tempered by realism. The absence of credible sightings, the silence of Lacey's phone, and the growing complexity of the evidence all point toward a grim possibility that no one is ready to state aloud. In the quiet moments between press briefings and search updates, investigators revisit the same question repeatedly. If Lacey did not leave on her own, and if there is no sign of an intruder, then the truth must be found in the spaces closest to her life. The answers, they suspect, are not hidden in distant places, but embedded in the ordinary routines of a marriage that now sits under an unforgiving spotlight. By the end of the first phase of the investigation, one thing is clear. This is no longer just a search for a missing woman. It is the opening chapter of a domestic murder case that will test assumptions, expose fractures beneath a carefully maintained surface, and force investigators to confront the unsettling reality that the most dangerous place can sometimes be the one that feels like home. In the days that follow, the investigation settles into a difficult rhythm. Search teams move out each morning and return each evening with the same unanswered questions. Detectives work late into the night, replaying interviews and refining timelines, aware that the earliest impressions often carry disproportionate weight. The case has not yet declared its true shape, but it is beginning to press inward, narrowing from the wide uncertainty of a disappearance toward the more intimate terrain of a domestic inquiry. At the center of that terrain is the home Lacey left behind. Investigators return repeatedly, examining not just the physical space, but the life it represents. They study calendars on the wall, notes on the counter, and holiday preparations that were never completed. Nothing appears disturbed. Her purse, keys, and personal items remain inside. The stillness feels deliberate rather than chaotic, as if time simply stopped rather than erupted. Detectives speak again with the people closest to Lacey. Friends describe her excitement about impending motherhood and her focus on the future. Family members emphasize that she would not have willingly walked away from her life, especially so close to giving birth. Each account reinforces the same conclusion, not as a dramatic declaration, but as a steady accumulation of certainty. Lacey had plans. She had commitments. She had no reason to vanish. As this picture becomes clearer, investigators turn their attention to the final hours before she disappeared. They reconstruct the morning in careful sequence, noting phone calls made, errands discussed, and movements reported. Small discrepancies emerge, not dramatic enough to accuse, but persistent enough to demand clarification. Detectives are trained to sit with these inconsistencies, to let them exist without forcing resolution too early. The search of the San Francisco Bay intensifies. Boats sweep designated grids, and sonar operators monitor screens for anomalies. The bay is vast and unforgiving, and even experienced crews understand how easily it can conceal evidence. Each pass across the water carries both hope and dread, because discovery would answer some questions while closing the door on others. Public interest continues to grow, and with it, pressure. Tips arrive from across the state, then from across the country. Some are sincere attempts to help, while others are fueled by imagination and fear. Investigators sort through them methodically, aware that public attention can illuminate hidden details but can also distort perception. They guard certain information closely, releasing only what is necessary to keep the search active without compromising its integrity. Behind closed doors at the Modesto Police Department, detectives begin to discuss the case in more direct terms. They consider behavioral patterns, domestic stressors, and the statistical realities that accompany the disappearance of a pregnant woman. These discussions are careful and professional, grounded in experience rather than accusation. Still, the focus is undeniably shifting from where Lacey might be to how she may have been lost. Financial records and phone logs are reviewed again, this time with greater scrutiny. Investigators look for signs of secrecy or divergence from routine, moments where one version of events no longer aligns with documented facts. None of this yet forms a complete narrative, but each fragment adds weight to the growing sense that the truth is not random or distant. It is structured. It has motive and method, even if neither is fully visible. As winter days shorten, the emotional toll becomes evident. Searchers grow quieter. Family members brace themselves for news they fear but feel approaching. Detectives, bound by objectivity, nevertheless carry the human weight of the case with them. They know that domestic murders rarely announce themselves loudly at first. They emerge slowly, through patience and persistence, through the unglamorous work of listening and re-listening until contradictions can no longer coexist. By the end of this phase, the investigation stands at a threshold. The outward search continues, but the inward examination has begun in earnest. The questions now being asked are more precise, more personal, and far more dangerous. Somewhere within the ordinary details of Laci Peterson's final days lies an explanation that will change how this story is understood. And in the next turn of the investigation, that explanation will begin to surface. As the investigation moves forward, its tone changes again. The urgency of the early search gives way to something more controlled and deliberate. Detectives no longer chase every possibility with equal energy. Instead, they begin testing theories against evidence, measuring statements against records, and observing behavior over time. This is the stage of an investigation where patience becomes a tool and silence can be as revealing as speech. Attention turns to patterns. Investigators examine how routines align with verified data and where they quietly diverge. They compare timelines to receipts, phone activity, and witness statements, not looking for dramatic contradictions but for subtle misalignments that repeat. In domestic cases, it is often repetition that matters most. A single inconsistency can be explained. A series of them begins to suggest intent. Surveillance becomes part of the process, though it is conducted carefully and without public acknowledgement. Detectives understand that people behave differently when they believe no one is watching. Movements are noted. Conversations are logged. Emotional responses, or the absence of them, are observed without commentary. None of this constitutes proof, but together it forms a behavioral profile that can either support or undermine stated narratives. Meanwhile, the search of waterways continues, though with a quieter urgency. Crews return to locations already examined, adjusting methods and angles. Winter conditions complicate recovery efforts, and investigators are forced to confront the possibility that evidence may surface only with time. In cases like this, discovery is often delayed, not prevented. The environment holds onto secrets until it decides to release them. Media coverage intensifies, shaping public perception in real time. News trucks line residential streets, and commentary fills the airwaves. Every development is debated, every silence interpreted. Investigators remain aware of the danger this poses. Public narratives can harden prematurely, making it harder to separate fact from assumption. As a result, law enforcement releases information sparingly, choosing restraint over reassurance. Behind the scenes, detectives revisit interviews already conducted. They listen again to recorded statements, paying attention not just to words but to cadence and emphasis. They note where answers came easily and where they required correction or clarification. Over time, these re-examinations reveal pressure points. Certain topics generate defensiveness. Certain timelines require revision. Each adjustment leaves a trace. Friends and acquaintances are recontacted, not because they are suspected of wrongdoing, but because memory evolves. Details dismissed as unimportant weeks earlier now carry potential significance. A casual remark, a comment about future plans, a statement that once seemed benign, but now feels misaligned with everything else. Investigators collect these fragments carefully, understanding that truth often emerges from accumulation rather than revelation. Emotionally, the case enters its most difficult phase. Hope has not disappeared, but it has changed shape. Family members begin to brace themselves, while still clinging to the possibility of answers that do not involve loss. Detectives, trained to maintain distance, nevertheless feel the weight of expectation pressing in from all sides. They know that the next break, when it comes, will not simply advance the case. It will redefine it. By the end of this stage, the investigation has quietly narrowed. The field of possibilities is smaller now, even if no official announcement reflects that shift. What began as a search has become an examination of trust, routine, and proximity. The answers investigators seek are no longer scattered across miles of terrain. They are embedded in human behavior, waiting to be confirmed. The case stands on the edge of transformation. Evidence has not yet spoken loudly, but it has begun to speak clearly. And when the next chapter opens, the silence that has defined this investigation will finally begin to break. The break comes not with a confession or a dramatic confrontation, but with the slow, irreversible force of reality asserting itself. Months after Lacey vanished, the waters of the San Francisco Bay begin to give back what they have held. Along the shoreline, remains surface in a manner that leaves little room for doubt. Investigators approach the scene with solemn precision, aware that this moment will define everything that follows. The identification confirms what many had feared and few were willing to say aloud. Laci Peterson and her unborn son are gone. The case, which had balanced precariously between disappearance and homicide, now crosses a line from which there is no return. For detectives, grief is set aside in favor of focus. The discovery does not end the investigation, it clarifies it. Attention turns fully to motive, opportunity, and method. Investigators compare the recovery location to previously examined movements and statements. What once appeared coincidental now aligns with unsettling precision. The geography, the timing, and the earlier inconsistencies converge into a single, coherent narrative. This is the moment investigators have been preparing for, not emotionally, but methodically. Surveillance intensifies, and observations take on new urgency. Behavior that once raised quiet concern now carries heavier significance. Detectives are no longer testing theories. They are confirming conclusions. Every movement is logged. Every interaction is weighed against the evidence already assembled. The case no longer asks what happened. It asks how long the truth has been concealed. When the arrest comes, it is deliberate and controlled. There is no spectacle, no chaos. Scott Peterson is taken into custody far from the home he once shared with Laci. Investigators act with certainty, supported by a body of evidence that has grown steadily stronger with time. The moment is quiet, but its impact is seismic. For law enforcement, the resolution carries no sense of triumph. Domestic murder cases rarely do. They are marked instead by a sober acknowledgement of proximity and betrayal. The answers, once hidden within routine and trust, now stand exposed. What began as a missing person investigation ends as a confirmation of the oldest and most unsettling truth in criminal work. The person responsible was not a stranger in the shadows, but someone at the very center of the victim's life. As the case closes, the focus remains where it belongs, on a woman who planned for a future she would never see, and a child whose life never had the chance to begin. The investigation has done what it can. It has spoken for those who can no longer speak for themselves. This is how the story ends. Not with mystery, but with revelation. Not with speculation, but with evidence. And not with distance, but with the sobering reminder that the most devastating crimes often unfold behind familiar doors, in lives that once appeared ordinary from the outside.